In today's video, I'll discuss if Christians are commanded to keep the Sabbath day. And by the end of today's video, I'm also going to tell you what I do personally, so make sure you stick around until the end. Now, when it comes to the Sabbath day, a passage which is pivotal to understanding how Christians should view the Sabbath day, one of them anyways, and another one we'll talk about later on in today's video, are a powerful passages from the book of Hebrews. This passage right here in Hebrews chapter 4. Now, really and truly, if you read the first 11 to 12 verses in this particular chapter, is powerful. We're going to just touch on some of it, but definitely I recommend you read this in your own time. So it starts by saying, "Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it." So the part that I need you to focus on first and foremost here is this rest that Hebrews is ultimately talking about. Notice what it's talking about here. It's speaking about the gospel being preached and how it was profitable to us who believed, but it wasn't profitable to those who didn't have faith mixed with the preaching. And it goes on to verse 3 to say, "For us which have believed, we do enter into rest." Hebrews is here using the example of the Israelites who came out of Egypt and were supposed to go into the promised land, which was a type of rest, but some of them, many of them, didn't get to go into it. Hebrews now relates back to the book of Genesis, and it says, "For he spake in a certain place of the seventh, on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his work." It's being tied in now to the seventh day Sabbath, and it's all being clustered under this category of rest. Now, as you scroll down this passage, he continues to give different examples. He highlights the passage from Psalm 95, and he talks about Joshua, basically here in verse 8, "For if Jesus," by speaking about Joshua because they have the same name, "had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day?" So the point that's basically being made here is there was a rest, but there was something greater coming. This is why in Psalm 95, the psalmist, way after Joshua, is talking about the people entering into the rest. But I want us to focus on verses 9 to 11 because this sums it up very nicely. He says, "There remains therefore a rest to the people of God." So bear in mind, he's spoken about Psalm 95, which is foreshadowing something according to Hebrews. He's spoken about the wilderness wanderings of the Israelites. He's spoken about Genesis chapter 2. And he says in verse 10, "For he that is entered into his rest," what has happened? "He also has ceased from his own works," right? So this rest, which was foreshadowed in the Old Testament, any of the believers who enter into this rest, we have ceased from our works, is what Hebrews is saying here. And this is very powerful because, as we talked about previously, he's quoted Genesis chapter 2 already, but it goes even deeper here because he says, "Just as God ceased from his work." So he's tying in Genesis chapter 2, how God worked and then ceased from work, right? The first time we hear about Sabbath in the whole Bible in Genesis chapter 2. Now, just as believers, as we enter into that rest, as we are saved, we cease from our works, right? We enter into the Sabbath, is what the Hebrew writer is basically saying here, just as God stopped in Genesis chapter 2. And in verse 11, notice what he says, "Let us labor, therefore," to do what? "To enter into that rest, unless any man fall after the same example of unbelief." So the point being made here in Hebrews is that the Sabbath day, right, the seventh day Sabbath that God created and blessed, was a shadow. It was a foreshadow of the ultimate rest that believers would enter into when Christ came to deliver us. The fact that this is a shadow is why we could look at passages like Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 to 17, which is basically saying the same thing. "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day," right? Like the Passover, for example, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath. And he continues, notice this, "which are a shadow of things to come, but the body of Christ." You see, when you look at a passage like Hebrews, And then you come to this sort of passage like in Colossians, it's quite clear the same language is being used. In verse 17, it's a shadow of things to come. I said earlier on in today's video, there's another powerful passage which really helps us answer today's question. Before we get to this, I want to focus on another passage which I also think is quite powerful in regards to answering this question today. Are Christians commanded to obey the Sabbath day? Now, this is a passage right here from Galatians chapter 2. I want us to look at a few verses in this particular scenario because it really elucidates this particular situation, this question. And notice, Peter was come to Antioch, the Apostle Paul writes. And notice what he says. And I withstood him to the face. Why? Because he was to be blamed. Now, what Paul's going to go on to explain to us is vital, especially for this concept of being bound by the Sabbath day. Because notice what he says. For before that certain came from James. James is the Lord's brother, right? What did he do? He did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, people from James, what did he do? He withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise. So not only Peter, but Peter was encouraging other Jews as well to stop living as Gentiles. In so much that even Barnabas was also carried away with their dissimulation. We'll read a couple more verses from here in a moment. But the point I need you to see here is that Peter, who was a Hebrew, right, was living as a Gentile. And Gentiles were clearly not bound by the seventh day Sabbath. And Paul doesn't say here that Peter started changing his behavior because it was wrong, right? Peter is arguably one of the most significant people in the early church, right? And this is somebody who was living as a Gentile amongst other Gentiles, no problem at all. It was only when people who were very religious, very zealous of the law came about, he now changed his behavior as if something was wrong. And this is why Paul had to openly rebuke him. But notice just a couple more verses. In verse 14, what does Paul say? But when I saw that they walked not uprightly, he said unto Peter before everybody, right? This wasn't a secret matter. Notice this, if you being a Jew, right, you're a Hebrew, you live after the manner of Gentiles and not as do the Jews. Why are you compelling the Gentiles to live as the Jews? So Peter, Paul says, you are living like a Gentile among Gentiles. And this is in accordance with the truth of the gospel. And if we are not living after the manner of the Jews, why are you now trying to compel them to do it when you are not doing it? It's hypocrisy. And then he continues, we Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. And this is the key part here in regards to the gospel message. Knowing that a man, 16, is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ. Even we have believed in Jesus Christ that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. Why? For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. So if, for example, you're engaging with somebody from the Seventh-day Adventist Church or a professing Hebrew Israelite, anybody who tries to compel you to commit an action as to showcase that you are saved is clearly going against the truth of the gospel and needs to be corrected as soon as possible. Now, although as Christians we're not commanded to keep the Sabbath day, there is something we all need to be mindful of, which I want to discuss after I highlight the other passage in today's video, which I think is very telling and very pivotal in regards to this particular topic of Christians being commanded or not commanded to keep the Sabbath day. And this is in Acts chapter 15. Now, I'm not going to read this passage or discuss this passage in depth in today's video, but I definitely recommend you read this in your own time. But the reason I want you to focus on a passage like this is because this was the same sort of argument that was coming up at this particular time with these Judaizers, right? They wanted Gentiles, especially, to keep the law, to be circumcised. And there was no mention throughout this whole chapter about Sabbath being something which is required for salvation. Now, before I tell you what I personally do, I said there's something I want us to talk about, which is something we need to be very mindful of. You see, after we just discussed Acts chapter 15, right, and all that happened there, right, at the Council of Jerusalem, they were not bound, Gentiles especially, to be circumcised or to do anything along those lines. But notice in the very next chapter what Paul did with a Greek believer, Timothy. It talks about how Timothy was a man who had a Israelite mother, but a Gentile father, right? His father was a Greek. And he had a good report among the brethren. But notice what Paul does in verse 3. Paul wanted him to travel with him on missions, right? Timothy is obviously very popular in regards to Paul's epistles. He mentioned it several times. And what did he do? He took and circumcised him. That even though, according to the truth of the gospel, you don't need to be circumcised, you don't need to keep certain actions of the law to be saved, Paul still circumcised him. Why? Because of the Jews which were in those quarters who knew that his father was a Greek. So a very key lesson I need you to understand as a Christian who's not commanded to keep the Sabbath day is to be mindful, right, in a loving way, of those around you who may be much more sensitive to Sabbath day observance or other things for that matter. And I think this is a good way to segue into what I personally do. Now, I think it's personally wise for Christians to take a day every single week to rest, but at the same time, it's not binding for several of the reasons we discussed in today's video. And today's video wasn't meant to be exhaustive anyway, but just to give you certain passages which can help you answer today's question. Now, obviously, one of the groups I mentioned in today's video was the SDA Church, who is very big on Sabbath day observance. Another thing they're very observant of is Christians not wearing jewelry. And if you want more insights on that one, I talk about that in this video right here.